So welcome everybody to Extinction Rebellion's Money Rebellion, a new phase for our movement, started in the UK. So we were launched in October 2018 and we had three simple demands: that we wanted the truth to be told about the climate and ecological crisis that we're in, that we wanted governments to act urgently and respond with mitigation policies that would reduce carbon emissions to net zero very quickly, and that we wanted citizens to decide how that would happen through Citizens Assemblies. Well, our mass civil disobedience has had great impact. People woke up to the crisis, councils and parliament declared emergency, and the government came up with a legally binding target, though way too late, at 2050. And they agreed to have a citizens panel to look at options, although again not legally binding. And in particular, there really has not been an emergency response to this most urgent of emergencies. And this emergency is not being given priority in the bailouts for COVID-related economic issues, so a real opportunity is being missed. Well, things have been getting far worse, actually. Recent news in June 2020 is that even the UK's official carbon budget is 2.4 to 3.2 times greater than what would be Paris compliant, as in safe. That's according to the Tyndall Centre for Climate Research. And other so-called climate leaders are at least a factor of 2 outside what they should be doing. And worse still, 20 leading climate research bodies have recently demonstrated in computer models that the potential for warming, as in climate sensitivity, is 5 degrees C. This means that the carbon dioxide that we've emitted and we plan to emit could cause far greater warming than was previously thought. So what this would mean is that during the lifetime of our children, most people will face existential risk. Half of the people in the world could die, that's about 4 billion people, and as much as 90% of species will be at risk of extinction. The UK Committee on Climate Change in June 2020, this is the government's own committee, said that the government was failing to meet its own targets. It's only met 4 out of 21 indicators. Only 2 milestones out of 31 have been achieved. And the committee are now saying that it's prudent to plan adaptation scenarios for 4 degrees of warming. This is a bit of a what the fuck moment, in fact, because in 2008, the committee said that if a 4 degrees C rise were reached, extreme consequences, potentially beyond our ability to adapt, would arise. This didn't even make it on the BBC News, by the way. The widespread view is that 4 degrees C means the collapse of our civilization. The chair of the committee, Lord Deben, said about the UK's climate crisis preparations that the whole thing is run by the government like a dad's army operation. We've got HS2, a deforestation of the UK, greater, the biggest one since World War I. And it's 100 billion being spent on essentially what's an aviation shuttle service. We've got COVID-related bailouts worth 16 billion going to 53 of the worst polluting companies. But these are crimes against humanity. And the big question is, like, how can this be happening? How can it be happening? We've got the science, we know what the score is, we've got government committees, we've got policies. We're not talking about whether the buses arrive on time here, we're talking about the fate of humanity, we're talking about whether we get to live or die, whether life on Earth carries on. So we have to face the depth of this and engage with it at its source. So what is this source? Why are we here? The thesis I want to give today is that we're in the grip of a malignant force. I'm just going to call it it. It's sometimes subtle and it's ultimately deadly and it's invisible. And we're so used to it, it distorts all we see. It decides what we're worth. It can't feel love. It's in our heads, but it's not in our hearts. What is this thing? It's actually been discussed in our culture. It's spoken about in myths and stories and memes, from Sauron in The Lord of the Rings to the hungry ghost of Buddhism that can never be fed sufficiently, to Cronus eating his own sons, to vampires, the myths of vampires. In Hinduism, it's the Rakshasas. They're shape-shifting, fierce-looking, enormous creatures, and they devour human flesh. In indigenous cultures, in the Algonquin native languages, it's called wetiko, or white man's disease. In fact, and it has fuelled colonialism in the past and in the current. And it's something that's inside of us. We can talk about the wounds that we carry in a society that's very traumatised, so traumatised that often we don't even realise, but maybe in a deeper part of ourselves we know that there's something deeply wrong, something off track, some place that humanity went on the wrong track, at least our culture, the Western democracies. There's a culture of separation baked in, and a culture of consuming to try and make up for this hungry ghost that many of us feel. It shows up in our politics as a politics of domination, of corruption, of divide and conquer. And it shows up in our economics, which are suicidal and based on infinite growth, and the main subject of today's conversation. So let's just step back and think about this amazing, beautiful planet we live on. Modern humans have been around for many years, mostly not doing vast damage for most of the time. There was some killing off of megafauna, and evidence suggests that indigenous cultures learned from that. We have this abundance of nature whereby the systems within it, the water system, the nitrogen system, the climate, brings all the materials and nutrients and the resources that's needed. So each has a part to play in this whole. Imagine living in a way that was part of that whole. Imagine feeling that time to run, to sing, to laugh, to dance, to play, to love, to learn, to adventure, to spend time doing things that we love, doing things that matter. That's not how things are for most of us, most of the time. In a way, an ecosystem, we can also think of it like a healthy body. A healthy body has systems to support the whole, to get materials where they're needed, systems to tackle and eliminate diseases. And you can think of a healthy economy like this. It gets materials to where they're needed, and a healthy immune system, which basically is a democracy creating laws and regulations, would ensure that the economic system functions for the greater good. But instead, our economic system is bound up in our culture. An economic and democratic system in the presence of wetiko, means that our way of life ends up acting like a cancer on the earth. And it doesn't have to be like this. So in this talk today, we're going to talk about it, the form it takes within our economic system, what that means, what that does to us, and a vision that we can be free from it, and the route to freedom involving financial civil disobedience. So, our economic system is killing us. It prioritises and pushes us to grow, to consume more, even though it's killing people today and making our planet uninhabitable. Clearly seen in the COVID crisis in the UK, there are over 44,000 deaths and more if you include second-order effects, with racially marginalised people 30 to 100% more likely to die, and yet far fewer deaths in other places that took this crisis seriously. And one of the issues is that it has been consuming our public services. In 2011, when NHS reforms came in, 400 senior doctors and public health experts wrote to the government and said the bill will do irreparable harm to the NHS because it's focused on commercialisation and marketisation, which would fragment patient care, widen health inequalities, and undermine the ability of the health system to respond effectively and efficiently to communicable disease outbreaks. And the UK government has as its number one issue that threatens UK life, pandemics. And yet where was our preparedness for this? Moreover, what we did was to delay action on COVID. Professor Neil Ferguson said of the SAGE committee, which is the advisory group for emergencies, that had we introduced lockdown measures a week earlier, we would have reduced the final death toll by at least a half. And it's not like the government didn't know that was what was being suggested by the scientists and the advisors. It's prioritising growth, the economy, over our safety. So in favouring profit and economic growth over all else, we end up in this constant discussion about GDP, gross domestic product. It's a measure of how much the economy is growing. It's seen as the most important thing. But actually, even by the creator of GDP, Simon Kuznets, he said the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income. If the GDP is up, why is America down? Distinctions must be kept in mind between quantity and the quality of growth, between costs and returns, and between the short and long run. Goals for growth should specify more growth of what and for what. Because in the eyes of GDP economic growth, farming's not seen as important. It's only 1% contribution to GDP. And things that last are bad because there's no more buying of things if things are going to last for a while. And that's why built-in obsolescence, as in things breaking easily, is part of the manufacturing process for many goods. And the harms and the costs that the system does, that goods and services create, just aren't measured. So why are we so attached to growth? So here is where we get to talk a little bit about economics, and this is not an economics talk, there's plenty online if you want to dig deeper. But one of the things that really drives economic growth is the need to pay interest on debts. And the vast majority of money in circulation is actually money that's created as a debt. And banks have been given the ability to create this money literally out of thin air. Just by typing into a computer. You go and ask for a mortgage, they type into a computer and new money is created. Most people tend to think that that money is being loaned from somebody else, somebody's savings. Banks have to have a little bit of money in reserve, but the vast majority of the money is new money created as debt. So 97% of all money that's in circulation is interest-bearing debt. Only 3% are notes and coins that you've got in your purse and wallet. And that's called sovereign money. So if it's debt, it attracts interest. And especially interest compounds, you have to pay interest on the interest sometimes. How are we going to get all this money to keep paying interest? Where's the resources going to come from? Well, quite simply, it comes from pillaging the planet. And there's this idea that we can have green growth, we can carry on growing, but we're going to do it in a green and sustainable way. It is true that some sectors of the economy could carry on growing and some need to degrow. Some countries need to carry on growing. It's not a completely simple picture. But in terms of GDP and how much materials are used in the world, as in biodiversity loss, as in destroying the planet, they are highly correlated. So we can't rely on this idea that we can simply have green growth and carry on with this system as it exists today. And the problem of excessive debt affects the majority of people. People are stressed out trying to make ends meet because housing in particular is super expensive, whether you've got a mortgage or you're paying rent. And it puts so much pressure on exploited countries who've been forced to take up our economic system and to get into debt and to push for austerity type programmes in order to fund that debt when they could be funding their own health services and so on. So governments are different to households. They don't get into debt in the same way that households do. Government debt is not as large either as personal or private debt. So if you look at this graph, you can see in red the mortgages and secured loans that people have, and also credit card debts, the debt of the finance sector, the debt of businesses. Government debt is relatively small in comparison, and it does not require austerity. Austerity is a political choice. And actually, government doesn't need to create money as a debt that it therefore then has to pay interest on. It has a choice. It can create what's called sovereign money. It's also known as monetary financing. So if we need money to pay for things, there is a route for governments to create money. We've seen it in the COVID crisis that this magic money tree does exist. That's not to say that we should be creating money at all, at any rate, at all rates. We have to take into consideration the impact it can have on an economic system, but money can be created by governments. But governments tend to create money as debts. Government bonds are called gilts, and this results often in taxpayers. We're all taxpayers, even those that are least well off pay VAT on goods and services, and that is a regressive tax. It affects poor people the most. So government bonds are created as debts, and then somebody buys those bonds. Guess who? People with more wealth and companies, and in fact some companies that are offshore avoiding taxes. And so we end up paying interest to people on the tax that they never paid us. Can you believe it? We've also signed up to what's called the Private Financing Initiative. It's another way of governments looking like they haven't taken on as much debt because they get private companies to pay for things like hospitals. It's a really expensive way of doing things. It's been said by Alison Pollock that it's a way to get one hospital for the price of two. The finance system and businesses profit from debt and debt money creation, and yet if they fail, we get to bail them out. It's been called socialism for the rich. Not here, though, to bash rich people and wealthy and corporations and so on. We are all part of this system and in some way trapped in it, in some ways wanting out, in some ways understanding that something better could happen. So this system is tearing us apart, favouring extraction over fairness. The rules of the system push more and more wealth to corporations and those already wealthy, and that tears at the fabric of our society. This is a graph of GDP growth and real wages and GDP growth don't track each other. And the richest 10% of UK households hold 44% of the wealth, and the poorest 50% of us own just 9%. There's a deep inequality between the richest and the poorest, in particular in the UK and also in the United States. Globally, we have over 2,000 billionaires that have got more wealth than 60% of the rest of the world's population. And when you've got that much money, guess what you do? You fly private jets around the world and so on. If the richest 10% of the planet reduce consumption to the average EU level, it would cut global emissions by 30%. Wealth is highly damaging when it's so concentrated. And the inequality hurts all of us, rich and poor. The prevalence of mental illness is much higher in countries where there's great inequality. So the most privileged reap the rewards of this system. Fossil fuels are subsidised at the rate of $10 million per minute, according to the International Monetary Fund. That represents 6.5% of global GDP. Well, it's not going to stop. Those who benefit from extractive growth have captured our democratic institutions. So the system can't bring itself back to sanity. It's just going to do more and more of the same. You can see this in examples like that 5 fossil fuel companies spend over $200 million annually on lobbying in order to scupper climate-motivated policy. You can see it in the fact that 6 billionaires own or have majority voting shares in most of the UK's national newspapers. They tell us what to think. And it's captured our democracy in the way that the UK government and the finance system are so deeply interwoven, to the fact that Parliament has a remembrancer who represents the City of London's interest within Parliament. He gets to sit in Parliament, he gets that access. You wonder who's the remembrancer for our reliance on nature, or who's the remembrancer that reminds us of society and how much we need it. And in fact, the City of London costs each UK household £170,000. It's cost it that since 1990. That's an analysis baked into Nicholas Shaxson's book, The Finance Curse, the capture of economic systems to big finance. So let's think of a government department, the Treasury, who thinks about taxation. Taxation, of course, pays for public services. Guess who supplies the Treasury, HMRC, with non-executive directors and supplies their working groups and so on? You wouldn't be surprised to see it's this many corporations. And as a result of that, of course, a further capture of democracy means that there is 123 billion of unpaid tax dodged annually in the UK. There's 32 trillion in assets untaxed offshore. 32 trillion is a kind of figure you can't really get your head around. One way to think about it is if you lay a dollar bill on the ground and stack them up, they would go to the moon and back 4 times. Apple alone has 200 billion offshore, it's estimated. The UK often talks about it being a leader. Well, there is a place it's a leader with its overseas territories and its crown dependencies. So Cayman Islands, Jersey, British Virgin Islands, and the City of London itself. Together, measured by the Financial Secrecy Index, they've been shown to be the biggest provider of corruption services across the world. We help to hide the wealth of corporations and the rich. It's a form of neo-colonialism. It means that poor countries lose $100 billion a year due to corporate tax dodging alone, almost enough to get every child into school 4 times over. How is this thing surviving? How are we letting that happen? It survives through dividing us, through separating us so that we can't feel each other and step into our collective empowerment. As inequality increases, trust decreases, we separate more, and we're more likely to scapegoat each other. This actually lays the ground for fascism. The 14 indicators of fascism are here, and inequality is a key driver. It uses divide and conquer to displace blame for the hurt that it's causing onto those that are actually the most vulnerable. So here's a graph of the rising cost of housing created by that debt money creation, drives up asset prices. And real wages amongst young people have not been increasing, creates a housing crisis. And yet what we do is blame it on migrants. It fuels racial inequality in many ways. 60% of racially marginalised households have no savings at all, compared to 33% of white households. And the average assets run from white households having 221,000 down to black African households having only 15,000. And yet, if you're a black person and a victim of fraud, you're more than twice as likely to be denied a refund by your bank as white customers. So there's this economic system, this political domination, this divide and conquer that's killing our planet. It's killing people now. It's making the planet uninhabitable. I want to hold out a vision that we can be free from it, that we can live. Because actually this system is bringing itself down. The Deutsche Bank economist said that the problem for the environmental lobby is that a world without economic growth may create a damaging backlash against such climate policies. It does require a lot of change. Nevertheless, the problem with the status quo is that irreversible damage to our planet will increase. what they said was, on the one hand, modern civilization is screwed. On the other hand, modern civilization is screwed. The system's bringing itself down, so we need to think about what to replace it with and not be taken down with it. I spoke of it, of wet eco, of the separation of the divide and rule, of the stress it causes, this extraction, scarcity mentality, exploitation, violence, greed, that feeling of powerlessness, that domination. I think it's something that when we stop and pause and think about the culture that we live in, it's something that we can feel. And how to move forwards from that. This is what XR's Money Rebellion is about. We're wanting to address the feeling of powerlessness in the face of this beast and in the face of an out-of-control economic system. So it's a personal and collective journey that I'm talking about, remembering of who we really are, that there is a different way to be in relationship to each other, to ourselves, and to the natural world. Because it needs us. We're spreading it, we're living it, but we don't need it. We are not it, we are different. We have the collective power together to do this differently. A starting point is gift economics. It's giving money to where it's needed. And when you think about gifting money, it's about establishing relationships. Gifts actually create obligations. I give you something, you feel obliged. You give me something, I remember you. I think about you in your times of need. Consumer culture breaks relationships. We can have a different culture. We have a cultural guide here. It's called the Golden Rule. What is it telling us? It's in many different religions, stated differently, but meaning the same thing. And in the simplest form, it essentially says, treat others how you would wish to be treated. And it's speaking to something deeper about our connection and our relationship, because what it's saying is that it actually hurts when others are being hurt. When we can feel it, when we can feel the separation, there's a painfulness, because actually we are all the same. We're part of the whole. We're beloved beings in the web of life. If people are hurting in other countries, if trees are being cut down, we can feel it in our bodies when we can pay attention and not be in the it, which also includes numbing us out and shutting us down. Okay, so there's a different way to be, and there are really practical alternatives to the system that we live in. It's not about going back to caves and all that, obviously. There's the idea of a circular economy rather than a linear economy. You can just take in a linear economy, make something and throw it away wherever away is. In a circular economy, everything gets reused and recycled, much like in a living system. John Fullerton talks about regenerative economics and finance. You have Molly Scott Cato talking about economics in a bioregion, how that could work. Kate Raworth has donut economics. It's to make sure you stay within the donut, within the boundaries of both the planet's resources and in terms of the resources of people in society. Tim Jackson has defined how we can have prosperity, because we can prosper, but we don't have to have growth to do that. There are positive solutions out there. For example, it's possible to have universal basic services. There's enough money around to pay for us all to have the basic things that we need. We could work with biomimicry in our technologies so that we mimic and learn from nature, and in that way don't do damage on the way. We can change international laws, for example, bringing the ecocide law into the Rome statutes, which would criminalise mass damage and destruction of the environment. And this thing of debt, we've got this idea that you've got to pay your debts, right? But actually debt jubilees, the forgiving of debts, has been enshrined in religions and cultures since we go back in time. The Lord's Prayer, for example, the 1611 version, more correctly translates the words from Aramaic, and rather than talking about trespasses or sins, says, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. This slide contains a picture of Steve Keen, who's talked about how to run modern debt jubilees in a healthy way. He uses a different form of economics to the dominant form, which happens to be called neoclassical. And then you've got other economists like Ha-Joon Chang teaching us about economics. If you really want to learn more, we can have different economic systems. In fact, Ha-Joon Chang says, tell me what you want the economy to do and I'll design one for you. Steve Keen has been calling out the economists that have been working with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and changing the science into really messed up policies. So one economist called Nordhaus actually got the so-called Nobel Prize for economics. I mean, it's not actually a real Nobel Prize, but for his work on climate change, where he made out as if it'd be okay if we got to 4 degrees of warming. Steve Keen has deeply debunked the economics there and says that Nordhaus's work has drastically underestimated the impact of climate change using really spurious data and trivial, what he calls, damage functions. And in that slide as well, you have students from Manchester University, economics students, who are saying their course is deeply inadequate. We need to put the environment at the heart of economics. So we can do better and we can measure what we're doing, right? We've talked about the problems in GDP. Well, there are other indicators for the economy, and here's just an example of one called the Genuine Progress Indicator, which includes both social indicators and environmental indicators alongside economic indicators. And guess what? It's been flatlining and decreasing where GDP carried on going up. So we're going to get asked, are we anti-capitalist? Well, that's obviously for each person to decide. I think it's a really unhelpful term myself. I've talked to this it. It's been around for centuries before capitalism took a hold, and it manifests in other economic forms. And the word capitalism means different things to different people. Sometimes people think if you're speaking against an economic system, you think that businesses are bad or that all markets are a problem and so on. All these things are things that we can discuss and consider alternatives around. There are some really great businesses around. For example, Frederick Laloux looks at some of them in his work called Reinventing Organisations. Here's an example of Buurtzorg, an organisation that provides independent nursing in the Netherlands. They use decentralised organising. You can come to work with your vulnerability and be a professional at the same time. And they use like self-organising management, and they're very much purpose-led. So they're happy to make a profit because a profit can help them in their purpose, which is to support independent living in the community by people that need help. They got 80% of the market share in the Netherlands. And guess what they did? Their chief exec, he went to his main competitors and said, I'll teach you how to be like us for free, because he was behind the purpose. That's the kind of businesses that will be the businesses of the future, really into purpose. And also bear in mind, Mrs. Thatcher, in a speech to the UN in 1989, said, we should always remember that free markets are a means to an end. They would defeat their object if by their output they did more damage to the quality of life through pollution than the well-being they achieve through the production of goods and services. So it's what the economy is doing that matters. And Milton Friedman, often seen as the father of this version of capitalism called neoliberalism, said that the great virtue of a market capitalist society is that by preventing a concentration of power, it prevents people from doing the kind of harm which really concentrated power can do. So he's about not concentrating power and harm not being done. Obviously, this system is achieving neither of those things. Well, it's not for XR to say what kind of economic system we want. We would always say we want Citizens Assemblies to look at this at all levels, from local to global. Imagine a global Citizens Assembly to rewire humanity, to look at the mistakes that we've been making. Citizens Assemblies involve a demographically representative group of people. They get experts and stakeholders coming in alongside them and facilitated and supported to come up with conclusions based on the evidence that they hear. Well, we know that nothing's going to change just because we want it to change. What we've shown in Extinction Rebellion is that civil disobedience is a part of waking people up. And so Money Rebellion is a next iteration of financial civil disobedience, a route to our liberation. Money rebellions aren't new. We know that civil disobedience works. You had the suffragettes, had a no vote, no tax campaign as part of their work. Gandhi led a tax campaign, a salt tax march across India. We had people refusing to pay the poll tax in the UK, speaking to our history of poll tax protest in the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. We can target financial institutions. It happened to Barclays Bank previously in the apartheid era. Their student market share dropped from 27 to 15% by the time it finally pulled out of that regime in 1986. And we can highlight the damage that financial institutions are doing, as we did in Rising Up with our Toxic Bankers campaign, through acts of civil disobedience. You've had US students going on debt strike to complain against poorly delivered education by for-profit organisations. So Money Rebellion is about gift economics. It's a financial disobedience to call out an economic system that's destroying life on earth. And it's about mass participation, us joining in if and where we can, because we've seen that this can be an act of initiation, an act of inner transformation, as well as collective power. It's our way of saying we are not going to serve it any longer. And it is okay to not pay debt and tax under certain conditions. For example, we know that excessive debt and tax dodging, as I've shown in this talk, are lethal structural issues that aren't being tackled. And that tax monies get used to worsen the climate and ecological crisis. Talked about the funding of HS2, the bailouts of polluters, the subsidies given by our government to fossil fuel organisations. And the use of debt as well to worsen the climate and ecological crisis, so the financing of the destruction of communities and nature to extract resources. What we're talking about is the breaking of the social contract, and we need to tell the truth about that, to act responsibly. It's not about passively sitting aside in the face of this and letting it happen on our watch. We've got a responsibility to intervene, a responsibility to those suffering now, to our children, to other life, and to future generations. Life on earth is dying. How's it going to work? Well, in gift economics, we'll give the money to a mental health charity, for example, instead of perhaps paying part of a tax return, if that's what you do. Or you might give money to restore nature as a small business instead of paying some of your small business taxes. Give it to a company that's working on the restoration of nature. Or you might give money to Indigenous resistance instead of paying money, some of your bank debt, to a bank that is funding the destruction of that Indigenous community. Or you might offer to work for your local community instead of paying some of your council tax, especially if your council is doing things that are making the situation worse. The tactics are these. We will start with so-called vanguard actions, those of us that are willing to start this thing off with demonstrator actions, and I'll talk about a couple of those in a moment. And then we'll use what's called conditional commitment. So I'll do it if others will join me, and we'll get to hear about this through cascading this talk and giving training. So you might say, I might do that if 10,000 other people with a mortgage with HSBC would join me. And rebel ringers will phone you up, find out what you're interested or willing to do, and we'll log that data, and then we can build action phases as we start organising together. Of course, there'll be legal and financial information and some support. We can do some myth busting. Some of this is less risky than people think, and we can talk about how to rebuild credit scores. We can also use what my friend Jojo from Stop Ecocide calls peaceful mischief. So we might do something for a while, create the story and the pressure on institutions and organisations, and then you might choose to not take it any further. You've gone as far as you want to. Your group could choose, so we'll be working with peer support. And we want to bake this in solidarity with those people that can't afford to pay. Some of us rebels can't afford to pay as well. We're going to be talking about ways to dispute debts legally and giving information so that people feel supported around debts that they have already. So this is about can't pay people united with won't pay people. What are we calling for? We've got to tell the truth about this economic system that's destroying life on earth. Both institutions and individuals, especially individuals of note, we want you to come out and talk about the mess that we're in and the source of this mess. And we want an economy that can prepare us for crises, because they're going to keep coming. COVID was an ecological crisis and others will come. We know that we're storing up antibiotics crisis, for example. So we need to be prepared for crises, and we need to stop the harm that we've been doing and start repairing it, using our money to repair the harm. And how we're going to go and do that, again, as I said, we want citizens' assemblies to decide. You might have specific demands associated with specific actions. So if a group of rebels in a local area want to stop paying some amount of their council tax, it might be to ask that council to not approve a local coal mine, for example. We can support that to happen. Or it might be a bank that's using its money for funding fossil fuel extraction. That's the demand to stop doing that. So if you're interested, here's some email addresses: moneyrebellion@protonmail.com. Get in touch. You might want to join a Vanguard action. We're going to be making donations on behalf of Barclays Bank and asking them to write off the debts that we incur. We're going to be working with small businesses who are willing to not pay a small amount of their taxes, to complain about how badly small businesses are treated and the climate and ecological crisis as well. You'll get rung up by a rebel ringer, find out more about your circumstances and what you're willing to do. You'll get information and training about legal and financial aspects. You could become a rebel ringer too. rebelringers@rebellion.earth. And you could spread a talk like this, the mrtalk@gmail.com. So come on, folks, let's get together. Let's do this.